Three, two, one, liftoff.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.
Hirsh, welcome back to the show, man. It's been 2 years. Can't believe it. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be back on, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be talking with you today. I think the core of what we'll be discussing is your recent article, which was published in Cultivated, which I believe is Jeremy Burke's publication, basically talking about the collapse of Herbal, which is the leading California cannabis distributor, handling over 700 million in product sales last year. And I think what you're, speaking to in the article is basically, the policies that have been put in place in California have really kind of led to the collapse of Herbal, right? I mean, has played a major part in it at a minimum. So talk to me a little bit about the article you wrote and kind of what's led to this bad policy being implemented in the state of California.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I should say it was great to write the piece. It was almost kind of cathartic. This has been on my mind for almost 6 years since adult use sales began in California. So it felt good to put pen to paper and to kind of get it off my chest. And also, I just want to thank, Jeremy Burke. He published this op-ed in his newsletter, Cultivated, which I think is excellent. And, he does a really good job of trying to elevate the public policy conversation in cannabis. So really appreciate him publishing it. But yeah, as you mentioned, Kevin, the focus of the paper is Herbal, which is the largest distributor in California that recently collapsed. And what I tried to do in the piece is to take a current event, which was the collapse of Herbal, and use it to tell a story about what is happening in the cannabis industry and in the California cannabis industry in particular. And, as you mentioned, the main lesson of the piece is that we need to move towards a less performative and towards a more substantive cannabis policy conversation. So yeah, that's the basic thesis.
And I think at the end of this discussion, there's going to be lessons learned and things that can be applied to other states, right? So it's not just about California. It's kind of waving the flag to say, hey, let's not make these same mistakes in newer markets. So let's kind of start there. Let's talk about basically first, I think I read in your article how California, will kind of virtue signal that cannabis is a medicine, but then in some cases treat it like a vice.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, California has adopted the maxim that, cannabis is medicine. This is something that the state's elected officials and policymakers say often. But, California taxes cannabis more than any other state. And, one of the things that, I point out in the piece is that California has, hidden local cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution taxes. It has a 15% state excise tax, and then, a local excise tax that can be up to 10%. And then a sales tax. And I mean, not to get into minutiae, but this really distinguishes it from other states, right? Other states often don't have hidden taxes that inflate the legal price of cannabis before state and local excise taxes are applied. Other states, sometimes they have local excise taxes, but those taxes are often capped, even in states like New Jersey, like high tax states, at 3%, or Massachusetts, they're capped at 3%. Whereas in, cities like LA, that tax rate is 10%. And then, as is now well known, California engages in this practice of double taxation, which means that its sales tax is applied on top of the amount that includes, right, the local and state excise taxes that are applied. So a lot of times we just compare, tax rates numbers to numbers. Someone will say, hey, Washington has a 37% tax rate. That's really high. In their market, they still have a robust legal market. But the actual cumulative tax burden in California is much bigger than any other state. So yeah, that's one of the points that is made in the article. We like to invoke this moral language of cannabis as a medicine. That was the underlying principle of Prop 215, which passed in 1996. California was the first state to say that people have a right to medically access cannabis. Everyone is familiar with the history of the medical cannabis movement that was born out, of sort of the HIV epidemic in the 80s. So that's all a way of saying, California policymakers invoke that maxim for good reason, because that's where the attitudes of the state are. But in practice, they tax cannabis like a vice, or to be fair, at 10 times, the tax rate of other vices such as alcohol and tobacco. And so, I know I'm sort of stating the obvious here, but, one of the things I mentioned in the piece is that the great, medical cannabis activist, Dennis Perone, one of many activists, but an iconic one, used to say all cannabis use is medical. If that is in fact true, then California, via its public policy, is telling its medical cannabis patients to patronize the illicit market. And last thing I'll say on this is that there was a great piece on this very issue in Cal Matters, which is a California publication last week, that really chronicles how medical patients with severe medical illnesses are patronizing these sort of illicit markets in the middle of the desert so they can buy cannabis legally. And that just betrays what California says it stands for. So yeah, that's one of the points in the piece.
Yeah. I mean, another interesting point that you brought up was, you talked about how California recently awarded millions in research grants funded by cannabis taxpayers, right? Or cannabis taxes. But the deep irony is that those studies, they were funded heavily on the tax burden that leads to small and medium-sized businesses being distressed, right? So wasn't the grant to focus on why, or it was the grant was to research how we could reduce anti-competitive behavior, right? And then to really uphold the ability for small businesses to thrive and prosper. But if you look at it from the outset, you're like, wait a second, the way we're funding this research project is actually hurting the small businesses. I mean, does that get talked about? Is that like, it's...
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And I mean, I think you described it well. So California issues research grants to universities to do things like, how to study anti-competitive behavior in cannabis, create a robust small business climate, to honor the legacy, the legacy of cannabis cultivation in California. These are all laudable policy goals, but as you kind of pointed out, there's a deep irony in the fact that these policy studies are being funded by that overbearing tax burden that we just discussed, and it is that tax burden that causes small businesses to become distressed and then be consolidated by larger operators. Obviously, a venture capital-backed company can sustain those tax losses for a greater period of time. Time is on their side. And so, yeah, there's a deep irony there. And look, I love the public university system in California. I'm a graduate, of the UC system. So it is exciting that the state is allocating research money to these great institutions to study these issues. But, we can't simply fund studies that talk about how we want a diverse and competitive market when we are creating policies that lead to the consolidation of that market. And I should say, we are seeing that in real time right now in California. What we will see take place in California over the next 12 to 24 months is likely a consolidation of these mom and pop operators.
What about Gavin Newsom's role in all this, right? I mean, from my understanding, back when Prop 16, is that correct? In 2016 was, or what was the legislation? I don't know if I'm
64
right. In 64, excuse me. Prop 64 passed in 2016. I mean, he was a proponent of that, right? He was talking about just all the various benefits of cannabis from both a policy standpoint, from taxation to even like the medicine itself. But it seems like in his years as governor, he hasn't been as friendly to the cannabis industry in California. Is that accurate?
I believe that is accurate. And I believe, his tenure as governor has been a great case study in this phenomenon of performative politics. And I actually think that, one of Gavin Newsom's most enduring legacies as governor is that he will have essentially squandered one of, the greatest economic opportunity of his tenure as governor. And that's primarily because of his fixation on this kind of performative politics, a desire to sort of make a splash and to see, policy issues as an opportunity to make a splash, and to present yourself as a supporter of a certain group without really any follow through. And I think it's an interesting sort of example to unpack because, as you mentioned, Gavin Newsom was one of the chief supporters of Prop 64 back in 2016. Now, some people might say that's not really a politically risky move to take, but unlike the current governor, Jerry Brown, he was a supporter of it. I remember on the eve of his 2018 election, him promising that he would create a pathway for hemp CBD foods and beverages, which still doesn't exist. And so although he's presented himself as a supporter of cannabis, when push comes to shove, he hasn't really been a supporter of the industry. For instance, last year during the tax debate, he actually proposed raising taxes rather than cutting taxes. And so, this isn't so much about him, but I think this is important to call out, because if we're going to move towards a more substantive cannabis policy conversation and a less performative one, we're going to have to call out when elected officials do this, do things of this nature. So it's one thing to say that you are committed to equity and to sort of recite that line, but we need to remember that taxes are an equity issue. Bureaucracy is an equity issue. Zoning is an equity issue, by which we mean, if the tax burden is too high, equity operators cannot succeed. If zoning restrictions are too rigid, what does that mean? That means there's a limited number of properties that are available in a city, which gives landlords the ability to drive up those prices. Now, predatory landlords may be a good talking point for an elected official, but in practice, the way to address that problem is to loosen up the zoning, right? So those properties aren't as expensive. And, perhaps one of the best examples of this is bureaucracy. Smaller businesses and social equity applicants don't have the resources to pay rent on empty storefronts for years. And so if someone is really committed to equity, it's not so much how often they recite the word equity or put out a press release that says that word, but what the public policy follow through is like. And, the last thing I'll say is we have seen examples of governors in other states that express a commitment to equity, but sort of back it up in policy. And I think one good example of this is a state like Maryland, which is a very blue state, has a very progressive governor, but has a governor who said, look, we need to keep these taxes low so small businesses have the opportunity to survive. We need to ensure that bureaucracy doesn't impede these operators from opening. So there we see two different models, and I think it's important to contrast the two. And maybe the last thing I'll say is the reason I think it's important to sort of pay attention to what elected officials do, not what they say, is that allows us to evaluate how consequential certain announcements are. So, for example, it's been now 7 months since California made the announcement about interstate commerce, when the DCC lawyer Matt Lee indicated that California was exploring whether interstate commerce was permissible, and the Attorney General would issue an opinion. Now, maybe the governor's office has a sincere intention to follow through on that promise, but I do remember when that announcement was made 7 months ago, there was people who were saying, this is imminent, and we haven't heard anything there. So we should scrutinize every announcement by saying, what does this person stand to gain electorally? In other words, we shouldn't take elected officials at their word, to put it crudely.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and it's funny as you talk. I'm almost seeing a crossover. Like it's almost like the elected officials in California, as it relates to cannabis policy, are sharing the same playbook with our federal elected officials. I mean, the constant virtue signaling and over promising but not delivering at all, right? And kind of using cannabis as the chew toy, as Morgan Davis would put it, like for the industry, just to kind of dangle a carrot and just on the hopes of another reelection bid or popularity among their district or whatever it is. But there's really no movement and no action.
I agree. Yeah, I think you see examples of this not only in other states, but also at the federal level, as you just mentioned. I think probably the best example of this was Chuck Schumer's legalization bill, the CAOA, that he introduced a couple of years ago. And I remember at the time, this was being heralded as a very equity-centric bill. But if we remember, the federal tax rate contemplated in this bill was 25%. If you're going to impose a 25% federal tax rate, there's no way any small business is going to survive. And yet there were all these bells and whistles associated with the bill. There was an incubator program, there were mentorship programs and small business accelerators. And look, those things may be great. And if implemented appropriately, right, I am all for them. But we can't be distracted by those bells and whistles when the structural economics of the system aren't working. I mean, similarly, the state of New York, has put out really robust training and mentorship programs. I hope those programs are excellent. However, regardless of how good they are not going to be effective if the structure of the legal market makes it impossible. And again, I think with just since we're talking about the federal level, I think the same set of calculations were on the minds of Senator Schumer and Booker. You don't have to be a political scientist to know that there was tremendous energy on the left side of the Democratic Party at that time, and that there was a very real threat to someone like Chuck Schumer from a potential primary challenge. And so it's not unreasonable for us to be thinking, okay, what are the political calculations of this person? That's kind of their what they do for a living. And too often we've sort of taken them at their word.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I want to get back to your point about the massive bureaucratic delays that, are the consequence of these bad policies, right? And you touched on the social equity component, but I'd really like to dive into California's dual licensing system and just explain how, the bureaucracy is elevated, right? But also how these poor applicants are paying rent. Like, I think you touched on it, like on these empty properties for years before they can even open their business.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And, it's really pretty simple. California has a dual licensing system. Now, what that means is that you have to get permission both from the local and state jurisdiction, both from, the local jurisdiction and the state. You have to get a license from each in order to open your business. Oftentimes, you can be waiting 6 months or longer for the state to approve your license after you've gotten permission from the local jurisdiction. And we should just be honest about the state of local government in California. These are often lowly paid officials. These are cities that are under-resourced, that don't have any basic competency in cannabis licensing. There's no check on their ability to impose new requirements years later. I've had clients who have been working towards a build out of a store for years, and 2 weeks before opening, a city will say, hey, we want a new HVAC system, and that might require you to redo this entire layout. And hey, it costs $200,000, and it wasn't in our ordinance, but tough. In order to get approval, you're going to have to do it. The irony is, as someone who knows India pretty well, a lot of those government's demands remind me of some of the stuff I've seen there. But that's maybe for another discussion. So that's all a way of saying you have to get permission both from the local and state jurisdiction. At best, these systems are very bureaucratic. There's no check on the ability of a local jurisdiction to demand something new. And so, yes, you have to pay rent on an empty storefront for years. We've just discussed how the price of that property is already inflated by restrictive zoning, meaning that you're paying 3 times what normal rent is. And how many people in this world have 20 G's a month to pay before getting a business open? And so, these are all pretty obvious things, but a city can pass an equity program and put out press releases about the injustices of the war on drugs. And I agree, those are unjust, but this isn't merely a college seminar, right? This has to work kind of in practice. And the other thing I'll say, as we're thinking about how this relates to other states, we are now seeing New Jersey, by some indications, it's a healthy market, it's good that it's gone adult use. But we shouldn't be surprised that it is taking so long for these equity operators to come online, because in New Jersey, there's also a dual licensing system. And so one of the lessons that we should have taken from California is that equity program won't mean much if you are giving these local jurisdictions veto power on the ability to open up businesses. And that's the issue.
That's a really good point that I have talked to numerous people about, and that's that veto power at the municipality level, right? These local jurisdictions. And it's like, that's what I want to touch on next, is like the why, like the decisions that were made to lead us to the point to where California is now. And I would think that allowing local municipalities to opt in and out of a cannabis program is probably one, right? That we should not, for future states going online, should not consider. And in fact, I think I've said this before, New Mexico, that was kind of one of the big provisions in the bill before it passed, was, there was one side that was really pushing for the opt-out ability for local municipalities, and the other side was saying no, because we've seen what happened in California. It won't work if we do that. And I'm so glad, shout out to Javier Martinez, who was on the podcast. They really dug their feet in, and they dug their heels and said, we're not moving this. We're not changing. This is a no debate item here. And I mean, I think you would agree. You want to dive into that a little bit and maybe talk about some other decisions that were made since 2016 that have kind of led to this problem?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. I think there's a few points to kind of make here, right? So you mentioned local control in California. And so if I were playing devil's advocate, right, if I wanted to be fair to state policymakers in California, I would acknowledge that, look, California has a really robust tradition of local control by virtue of it being such a big state and having such, significant cultural and geographic diversity. One could say, hey, that's the third rail of California politics is messing with local control. And I think there's some credence to that argument. But if that's the case, then state policymakers should not be able to get away with saying cannabis is an essential business or cannabis is medicine. If you were going to say
other. Yeah.
Right. It's one or the other. And if you are, say, seeking the presidency in theory, and you don't want to antagonize a bunch of local government leaders and potential people that could be beneficial to you in a primary, sure, that's fine. Own that decision. You can't, on the one hand, dress yourself up in the moral language of cannabis as medicine and access, and at the same time make the more real politic decision that, hey, I don't want to mess with these folks in Kern County because that could make a future election harder. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, even with local control, there have been, and I agree with you on your points about New Mexico, and I think New Mexico and Minnesota are a couple of states that are interesting in that regard we should talk about. But, even in states that embrace local control, there have been less awful versions of it. And I think the best way to understand the California market, to me, is to compare the California and the Michigan market. Now, why do I say that? They're remarkably similar, and yet they've diverged over the past, say, 24 months. They're similar in the sense that they have local control, right? These states legalized adult use, but then they said, hey, cities, you do kind of what you want on cannabis and come online when you want. So they both kind of started slowly with huge deserts across the state. They both have a huge, tradition of a robust illicit market. People don't know that, Michigan is kind of like the Midwest. Kind of there. They have a decentralized kind of licensing structure. They've both gone through these price crashes over the past, 24 months where, Michigan's wholesale prices have crashed. I bring this up because there's so many similarities between these two states. But if we had a chart of their sales growth over the past 24 months, you will see that Michigan is steadily ticking upward, whereas California is steadily ticking down. And so you ask yourself, why is that? Well, that's because cities in Michigan, they pass an ordinance and they don't have this sort of unchecked bureaucracy that California does. Michigan has had 50, 60 cities pass ordinances over the past few years, just like California, but those stores in Michigan actually open, whereas Fresno passed an ordinance 4 years ago, and only 2 of 21 stores are open. So I think the point there is, even if we say, hey, one of the political realities as we move past the stage of the war on drugs is we have to give these local leaders some say, I think we can point to places where it's totally dysfunctional, like California, and places where, even if imperfect, and we know the Michigan market is imperfect, it's still growing, right? It's still getting stronger. It's still on what one would call a healthier trajectory. So that's the second point. And then maybe the final point I'll make is basically just agreeing with you that, states that limit local control, that don't give them essentially veto power, will be more successful in the end, right? You mentioned New Mexico. New Mexico sales just continue to climb, right? I think the latest monthly sales was 47 million, which puts it almost at a $600 million run rate for a state of 2 million people that is one of the lower income states in the country, just objectively. I mean, that's remarkable. And, just one other example of a market that I'm excited about, even though we're going to have to wait a while, is Minnesota, because it has said, hey, you got to have at least one retailer for every 12,000 citizens. And if you look at some of those small towns on Minnesota that border like Iowa or these, like, that's where I want to open a dispensary, man. Because it's gonna be incredible. So yeah, I think that's more of what we need to see.
Yeah. Your point about New Mexico, while their sales are incredible, because it is true. I mean, I would say that a lot of those sales are coming from Texas. Also, those border cities like Carlsbad, not Carlsbad, but El Paso, Sunland Park is another one, right? There's cities in New Mexico that border certain areas, particularly Texas, where, they're coming in. The state alone only has 2 million people, right? So, but I think to your point about Minnesota, we're going to start to see that as well, right? With Iowa. And it's going to be interesting because traditionally those Midwest states are very conservative. They're very red. They're opposed to cannabis, right? But it's like, what are they going to think once they start to see, hey, we're losing that revenue that we could bring here to the state, right? Because they're going across the state lines to Minnesota to go. So
yeah, It's a great point you're making about Texas, by the way, for sure. And just one thing, I often wonder whether Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor of Texas, who in Texas, the lieutenant governor, like it's the opposite of California, they have veto power over all legislation, and he keeps blocking cannabis. It would be funny if he turned out to be like a shareholder in like some big New Mexico cannabis company. You know? So,
hey, you never know with these politicians today, man. You never know what's happening.
Totally.
That's for sure. Go ahead.
One more thing I just want to say about New Mexico, since you brought it up, and I know you're from there. Again, no market is perfect, and one could criticize the New Mexico market for many reasons. There will be a lot of carnage there, given how open of a market it is. But one thing that I think is interesting is, I like to read a lot of the local news on cannabis, all across the country. And whenever I read local news about New Mexico cannabis businesses, it's often someone that is a middle-class person, right, that has some diverse background that is owning and operating these businesses, right? It'll be just like a middle-class veteran and their wife opening up a business. And that stands in stark contrast to at least the people I see owning cannabis businesses in many other states, even those that have equity programs. And so other people have made this point. I think, Christine De La Rosa, who I don't know, but I've listened to her talk about this, I think have made the point that if there are states that don't, quote unquote, have an equity program, and yet they seem to be enabling ordinary people to gain ownership in this industry and people of diverse backgrounds that reflect what this country looks like, then, not saying those states are perfect, but maybe there's something to be learned from them. And maybe Connecticut, which has a social equity program, but has a $3 million fee for that program, maybe that's not really the model for equity. So that it just goes back to what we were saying earlier, how do we treat this as a public policy question that, gives people access to this industry, not merely as an opportunity for me to say, hey, like, here are the set of values that I have, which are important, but they can't just stand there on their own, Right.
Yeah, there has to be substance, right? And that's a good segue, because I want to ask you, Hirsh. I mean, you kind of broke down the why, right, and where we are now in terms of the cannabis market in California. But I want to hear from your view, like, what is substantive cannabis policy look like to you? I mean, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of boring, but it looks like, hey, what is an ideal tax rate, right? What are the number of, Bo Whitney, an economist, does this kind of work. Like, what are the number of licenses that we should issue that will prevent a price crash that will ruin all of these entrepreneurs we're attracting to this market? What impact does local control have on the growth of the industry? So none of this stuff is particularly sexy, but it's just, nuts and bolts conversation, policy conversation, like we do in other spaces. And I think the point is, obviously, cannabis has a very unique history, and it means more to many of us than other commodities do. I think there's a way to, still retain fidelity to those values and principles that we say we care about, that cannabis is medicine, right? That this industry should not be monopolized, right? That we want to see a diverse landscape. There's a way to really believe those things, but to say, okay, what are the different menu of policy options that we have along these 7 levers, and how are we doing against those goals, and how do we tweak this going forward? I mean, it goes back to the idea that, America at its best is our laboratories of democracy. And so we should be able to compare, now that we have, more and more states coming online, we should be able to compare these policy experiments and see what outcomes we have. So pretty basic stuff, but I think we've kind of gone away from that in the cannabis industry for some reason.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and is there action being taken now to address some of these issues and these challenges that we're seeing and that we've discussed here today? I mean, are the local officials within California receptive? Are they open to it? Or do they even acknowledge that there is a problem?
I can't say that there's much meaningful action taking place, which is sort of disheartening. But unfortunately, that's the state of affairs. Just to give you one example, this year in California, we tried to get a bill called SB 512 passed. SB 512 would have helped end the practice of double taxation in California. Again, it wouldn't have lowered the tax rates. It would just prevent what I was talking about earlier, when you tax on top of a tax. It would just say, hey, you probably should, the rates can still stay the same, but we're just going to stop the tax on top of a tax. And even that bill was defeated in committee. So yeah, for that reason, there's not much reason. I hate saying this, but yeah, there's not a lot of reason for optimism. And so I mean, that was part of the reason that motivated me to kind of write the piece. I know this sounds kind of pie in the sky, but I think, there is real value in storytelling, right? Right now, like, that storytelling could use some sharpening. And, if we improve the storytelling, if we look at elected officials through the lens of what they're doing and not what they're saying, I think that can get us there. I know that sounds very theoretical to some people, but I believe that, and especially in this information age, right? There's a way that a new narrative can kind of take shape, and I think that's the collective project we have to work on in California. And then, again, I've said this before, but there's nothing better than contrast, right? I really believe that as more states come online, there's nothing simpler for the mind to imagine, like, why is New York this way and Maryland another way? That sort of comparative analysis, I think, can be the impetus for change, because no one wants to say, hey, I'm screwing up in my state.
Yeah, I mean, what other country, like you said, the laboratories of democracy, right, can sit back and basically just kind of cherry pick what works and what doesn't from various states, and then apply it to their own, right? And whatever makes sense for that given state. I mean, it's a perfect opportunity, and I couldn't agree more with the point you made about, and I'll use the term collective intelligence, right? I mean, storytelling is super important in any industry, and we've kind of learned that with the evolution of content and the dissemination of content and the amount of content and data that we have today. So the more and more that the cannabis industry can come together in that collective consciousness, that collective intelligence, and tell the story of how people have been disenfranchised, right? Different races. I mean, even the industry today in terms of small businesses compared to large MSOs. I mean, it's just, there's this story that we could tell, and the better that we do that and the more education that we put out there, it's going to be really hard for these elected officials to combat it or even keep doing what they're doing now to hurt the industry, right? Because we're shining a light on it, and a lot of people are listening and even helping disseminate that message.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially on the power of storytelling. I also think if you can put things in a language, sometimes people don't have a language to describe what they're experiencing or don't have the data. But if you can give voice to their experience, then there's a way that can spread powerfully. And so I think that's what's called of us. And yeah, that's the storytelling project. And the other thing I would say is all of us can do something. I think the information ecosystem is still so nascent in the space that individual people have the ability to shape narratives. I mean, I'll just give you one example. When Missouri came online, I just continued to pester reporters at the Chicago Tribune to be like, hey, have you considered the difference between Missouri and Illinois? Look at the difference in the tax rate. Isn't it interesting that you can see and smell the product? Well, you should probably, look at like how the out of, state sales kind of
There's
decrease.
A story here, right? This story. Yeah.
There's a story, right? And particularly for folks that aren't steeped in cannabis, they're like, oh, there's a story here. And, maybe the Chicago Tribune would have written that story without me, or without any of us, but they did write a story. And in that story, there was a defensive quote from the Illinois regulator saying, hey, our program is still great, even though you can't see and smell the product and our taxes are high. And, maybe that prompts a little introspection there. So I think that can even be done at the local level, with cities in California by contrasting neighboring tax rates. So there's this is a grassroots movement, I guess, and we all need to get engaged.
Yeah. What also fascinates me is to that point is like the added benefit of us collectively telling this story is that people even outside of cannabis that are just, foreign to it even will maybe start to understand that there's so much overlap with this plant and the issues and challenges that we currently face today. So I'll give you an example, right? Big pharma, right? Like there's, as we know, being in the industry, cannabis is medicine, right? And there's a lot, while there are prescriptions that are important, I'm saying it's not a total replacement, but it could be an alternative to some prescription medicines or pills that you're taking, right? So there's medicinal benefit. We also talk about the challenge of climate change and how, what this past month was the hottest month on Earth in the last 120,000 years. Well, if we wanted to effectively combat climate change, we would grow hemp because it sucks in so much CO2 emission. It enriches the soil. It cleanses the soil, right? So then from the industrial side, I mean, plastic is an issue. We see, oceans being polluted with plastic and trash, and well, we can build things out of hemp, right? And we don't have to cut trees down anymore. I mean, so there's so many advocates out there and so many allies for these different issues, but at the core, if just people understood the value and the benefits of cannabis on all so many different levels, I mean, I think that they'd be more inclined to pay more attention to what's happening in this industry.
Totally. I mean, I couldn't agree more on the hemp thing. I'm really enjoying reading and learning more about hempcrete, which is in the news more and more, as a sustainable building material. That's way outside of my realm of expertise, but everything I read about it makes it seem incredibly exciting. And it's a reminder that this cannabis, movement is much broader than, the sort of narrow regulated channels we operate in now. So yeah, that's that part of it is super exciting.
It's exciting, man. It's exciting to be part of it. It's exciting to have, experts like you on that are on the front lines, really seeing it firsthand. And I know we've kind of been a bit doom and gloom in this episode, but it's important to talk about, the reality of some of these markets. And California is not, it's struggling right now, and that's evident. And so, Hirsh, I want to give you the opportunity. I mean, do you want to end on a positive note? Maybe talk about something that you're looking forward to or what you're working on before we wrap up.
Yeah, let's end on a positive note. What am I excited? There's a few things that I'm excited about. I'm excited to hopefully hear that Ohio qualifies for the ballot in the next few days. And if it were on the ballot in November, I think it stands a good chance of passing. And it would be the 24th state, which gets us closer to that tipping point. It's also the home state of Sherrod Brown, the Senate banking chair. It also borders a bunch of prohibition states. If you think about, Pittsburgh, it's practically in Ohio, or a lot of places in Indiana. So that is really exciting. And I think that's exciting. And then and just the state-led growth story. I think New Hampshire could be number 25 in January, February. So those things are exciting.
Awesome, man. Always enjoy your insights. Very knowledgeable in the space, Hirsh. Where can people find you, follow you online to get more of these great insights?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and it's Ananda Strategy. That's ANANDA Strategy on either platform.
Awesome. Hirsh, thanks again, man. And I appreciate it. Let's have you on again real soon. Hopefully there'll be some movement in addressing some of the issues that we talked about today in California. If not, we can talk about Ohio and some of the other states that have come online or are coming online as this industry continues to just grow and expand.
Totally. Thanks, Kevin. This was fun.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. Bye.
Three, two, one, liftoff.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.